Hey everyone, welcome back to More Flesh and Bad, and today we're going to be wrapping up our 10 micro optimizations to improve your Fab gameplay series. This is going to be part 3, which I've titled Be Annoying, and before we get into it, I do just want to mention that if you have any ideas for like discussion topics, feel free to post them in the comments. With that, we're going to go ahead and get into it. So what do I mean by be annoying? By being annoying, I don't mean like being like this cat here, who's very much like our brown cat who likes to knock over everything in sight. What I'm really talking about is being annoying, as in like presenting your opponent with difficult situations. That's kind of like the core thing we're talking about when we're talking about Fab and being like kind of annoying. So I've kind of split these into like 3 different segments. So the first one I kind of want to talk about is breakpoints. So I first wanted to kind of start off by talking about what a breakpoint is. And the best way that I can kind of describe it in my own words is just a magically annoying number that makes cards difficult to block. So double strike, for instance, this is like the quintessential breakpoint card, right? So instead of coming in for like 2 damage or 3 damage, it's coming in for 1 and 1, which is actually like to some extent better in some circumstances. Like sending 1 and sending 1 could sometimes actually be better than sending like 3 damage, right? So when we're talking about Fab in specific, like breakpoints tend to not be multiples of 3 because for the most part, most cards in the game block 3. So in the couple of examples I kind of listed here, like 3 and 6 and a multiple of 3 is generally not a super annoying breakpoint, since most decks can either block like 3 or 6. 4 is where you kind of start to see like a little bit more annoying breakpoints, but 4 is still not an incredibly annoying breakpoint depending on the meta, right? So if you have a lot of reacts in the meta, 4 can sometimes be just about the same as 3 depending on the deck. Like into like Enigma, for instance, or New. Most of those decks run a bunch of 4 blocks in their deck anyways, so like blocking 4, not necessarily like the best breakpoint in the world. 1, 5, and 7, regardless of the meta, tend to be quite annoying because, like, let's say you have like a 1 like double strike, for instance. 5 like sensors also quite annoying because 5 in specific means you can't react it, so you have to give like 2 cards to it, which is really good. And most like 5 attacks come in for like 1 cost, so you can like chain it with like a 2 attack or 2 cost. And 7 is also pretty annoying, but notably 7 is like kind of has the same problem as 4, where if you're running into a deck with reacts, like 3 plus 4 is also pretty easy to cover. So it's what I'm trying to get at here is kind of, it's a little bit contextual about like what the meta is. If we're in like a blocking meta, which we kind of are now, where decks want to block to some extent, coming in for like 7 or 4 is not necessarily like as good as coming in for like 1, 2, or like 5, for instance. So a lot of it depends. Now, for instance, 4 can actually be really good if we're not in like a blocking meta, and most decks just run a bunch of 3 blocks, for instance. So it really depends on like what the current state of the game is. So like breakpoints that are good can kind of change based on the meta. And why do we care about breakpoints specifically? The most obvious reason, right, is we want to make it harder for our opponents to block, so that we can leak damage and eventually like kill them, right? It also matters for like on hits, etc. Kind of like what we've been talking about like this entire series. We also want to think about like the breakpoints that our cards are defending for. So like if we're running like sync below and stuff, we want to try to pair like our blocking cards with like pieces of armor to maybe cover known breakpoints. So like for instance, if our opponent is like Aurora and I'm on Zen, right, and they're sending a snatch at us, what I want to try to do to block that out, if I can, is maybe block with like a 3 block from hand and then a 1 block on like Pouncing Paws. I don't even think you run Pouncing Paws in Aurora anymore, but besides the point, you want to think about like how to set yourself up to cover annoying breakpoints. And cards that aren't breakpoint cards can still be good. So I wanted to highlight this out, that while breakpoints are like a very important part of the game, sometimes the numbers on cards kind of can exceed the breakpoints, right? So the cards I kind of wanted to look at are like Rune Ranger Swarm and Hunterwind. So these are like cards that only come in for 3, but like they synergize so well with the deck that you have to probably just run them anyways. So Rune Ranger Swarm kind of creates a breakpoint if you think about it, especially like Viserai, where you basically get like 1 extra rune chant when you play it, right? Hunterwinds has like a ton of combo synergy, so even if this card is not off the breakpoint, you can also like tutor for it, so you kind of have to run in the deck regardless, right? And it just says Gogan. Just because it's not a breakpoint card doesn't mean that like a 0 for 3 with Gogan is bad, right? A 0 for 3 with Gogan is quite good. And then like the quintessential card that doesn't follow any breakpoints is like Command and Conquer. So Command and Conquer, by our logic, should be a bad card, right? Because it only blocks 6, but like we all know that Command Conquer is like one of the strongest cards of the game. So just because the card doesn't have good breakpoints doesn't mean that contextually that card is bad. Breakpoints are just kind of an important thing to manage basically when you're trying to kind of whittle down your opponent and get them to make like suboptimal blocks. So to try to illustrate, I guess, how we can distribute breakpoints, I wanted to take a look at this example. So let's say we're playing a Zen here. We've got like this really nice 4-card Transcend hand that we're playing against a Enigma who's got like a big mirror guy out, right? There are a couple of ways we can kind of distribute the breakpoints here, and they both ultimately add up to 16 damage. I briefly did the math while I was doing this example. So the damage is basically the same here, but the way we were kind of like distributing the breakpoints is a little bit different. So in the first option, we have like 1, 2, 2, 4, 3, 4. And the second option, we're doing 1, 1, 4, 2, 4, 4. So very different ways to kind of like distribute the damage. So I think that there is one that might be a little bit better than the other against Enigma in particular, where like if we're sending a bunch of ones front loaded, that might mean that they need to block with like a 3 block on one attack, and maybe they give like Phantasmal Footsteps to the first one, right? Forcing them to basically commit a 3 block to a 1 block is really, really good, because we can basically try to run them out of cards, and maybe they don't have a 3 block for something later in the chain, right? Whereas with the top example, we are maybe having 2 on 3, which is a little bit better for the Enigma specifically. But again, a lot of this is kind of like game dependent. So know kind of like your opponent's deck and stuff to kind of figure out which breakpoint distribution is kind of like better for you. I think this also kind of does depend on armor a little bit. So we're just talking about cards for now, but armor also kind of plays into like breakpoints. So if your opponent has like a two block temper armor or something, right, then obviously having more 2s is a little bit worse. 2 plus 3 is like 5-ish, right? So like if you block with two armor, you block with the 3 attack, then you don't want to have anything on 5. But having 2 on 2 is also not ideal, right? So I think that the bottom hand has like a little bit stronger break points, just because we have 2 1s and 3 4s, which is basically like a full house in Balacho, right? A lot of this is contextual, so you'll need to kind of like determine this for yourself. But if I were to pick like a line here, I'd probably try to go for like maybe the bottom line here. So I think another example of being annoying is the concept of bricking. So I think that you can kind of think about this from 2 perspectives. So either not bricking with your deck or forcing your opponents to brick. And this is a way that you can kind of be annoying to your opponent and kind of like force them into bad situations. So I want to kind of start off with an explanation on what bricking is. So it's basically just when you draw like shit, right? So whether that's due to variance, whether that's due to like getting D-React second hand, whether that's just like your hand does nothing, there's a lot of like variance to Flesh and Blood, even though it's like a pretty low variance card game. But if you can force your opponent into a situation where their deck just like bricks out and sends like a very low damage turn, then you can actually use that turn to kind of pivot and kind of take back the tempo, basically, right? How does bricking occur, I guess, is the main question. And I think it's most often when you have like a defensive package, so like Sync Fate, like Reduced to Rune Chant. These are all kind of like D-Reacts that contribute to like the brick rate of a deck. So the downside to some of these defensive packages is that sometimes if you're given a full grip, like a full 5-card hand, sometimes you might not be able to do anything, right? So if you get like 2 sync blows in hand, maybe you're sending like 7 damage total, right? And that's mainly the drawback, I guess, of some of these more like defensive decks, is that even if you give them a 5-card hand, they might not always be able to do something with it, right? If your opponent is playing a defensive package that you can get them to brick, is to try to concede tempo. And what I mean by that is to like not attack into them. So if you want to, like, let's say your opponent's swinging like 14 at you and you block 12 out, and then like maybe try to arsenal something past to them, right? If they're given like a 4-card hand and they draw like 2 D-Reacts, you've successfully gotten them to brick, right? And I think this works against like some decks better than others. So like Viserai, for instance, I think bricks a little bit more than like Aurora, for instance. Like Aurora is a very, very consistent deck that pretty rarely bricks, but it can still happen for sure. But like Aurora is not like a great example for this, right? So we kind of talked a little bit about forcing your opponents to brick, but the flip side of that is also trying to get your own deck to not brick. And I think this is mostly kind of done in deck building or sideboarding, where you're basically trying to get a very consistent game plan to the point where even if you're given any random 4-card hand, you can at least send like 10 or 12 damage or something, right? So a common example of a card here is like E-Strike. So E-Strike is like a kind of on-rate card. It's like mostly filler though. Like a lot of the time, the E-Strike is not like the best card in the deck. But what E-Strike does provide is a way to kind of unbrick react. So you can like bottom a react to E-Strike to like give go again, and then send like another 2 cards at your opponent, right? And that's a very good value trade. There are also like equipment pieces that can kind of help you unbrick hands. So like Pouncing Paws, Grasp, Snapdragons, Warband of Bologna. Like these are all kind of really good equipment pieces that will enable you to kind of utilize your hand even if you draw like a really, really bad hand. So a lot of this is done in kind of like deck building, but if you can reduce your ability to brick while also forcing your opponent into situations that brick, that is like a very good micro optimization for just improving the overall like flow of the game. So for this example, I wanted to kind of show some examples of what I consider to be bricks versus non-bricks, and maybe this will be helpful to some folks. We're gonna ignore like the arsenal here in these 2 examples, but the first hand, let's take a look at this. So we have like a card for 2 into like Pouncing Key, and if we really want to like get super greedy for some reason, we could like throw Grain that tips the scale. So like this is like a 6 damage max hand, more like 5, right? So this I would consider to be like a brick hand. If we're given a 4-card hand, we can only deal 5 damage. I think that qualifies as a brick. But if we have like this hand below, this is a hand that has E-Strike in it. And one of E-Strike's kind of like powerful effects is unbricking your hand regardless of what's in your hand. So if you do like E-Strike bottoming Tiger Swipe and then send CNC, you're sending 11 damage on a 4-card hand, which is very good, especially when some of that damage is CNC. So this is an example of a hand that, even though we drew some reacts, we actually have like E-Strike here to kind of basically save us from like a react hand or a hand that doesn't really do anything on paper, right? For this last slide, I wanted to talk about limiting your opponent's options. And I think this is also kind of a very important little micro optimization you can make. So you basically, your goal in Flesh and Blood is to try to put your opponent in kind of like a lose-lose situation where even if they have like the best possible card in a situation, they're still not ahead. So this is kind of like forcing your opponent into situations where there really isn't a good play no matter what you do, right? So the common cards that kind of introduce this lose-lose situation are cards that have like disruptive effects. So like Censor, Bonds of Agony, Command and Conquer, etc. Like these are all kind of example cards of situations where even if your opponent does one thing, you can just do another thing and they still lose a ton of value. So I think Bonds of Agony is like the most egregious example of this because Bonds of Agony is basically like one of the most unblockable cards in the game. Just either coming in for 1 damage with Go Again, and then you get like Mask of Recurring Nightmares, or they have like Siren's Call. Like there's a million ways that like a new, for example, can proc a Bonds of Agony, and pretty much all of them are bad for you. Similarly, I guess kind of same thing with like Merciful Retribution plus a Herald. So in a situation where you have a Merciful on the field and then you're also swinging with the Herald, if your opponent goes for a pop, the Herald will go into Soul anyways. Whereas if they hit with the Herald, you're also putting them into Soul. So unless you like block 6 on a Herald with no poppers, the Herald's going into Soul like kind of regardless. And then there are like some other kind of like disruptive effects like Scaling Flesh Bag. Depending on like your opponent's hand, if you banish like any card from it, and like they can't use their arsenal or something, like you basically introduce your opponent to a situation where they lose no matter like what they do, right? So these are all kind of like premium examples of forcing your opponent to kind of play in a way where no matter what they do, they basically kind of lose. So for this final example, I wanted to kind of showcase the most like bullshit new hand that I was able to come up with. So we have here Bonds of Agony, right? And we also have Pathful Traveled and Venomous Bite and a Codex of Frailty. So there are a couple different lines we can basically do with this hand. All of them basically start with sending Bonds of Agony. So let's say our opponent opts to not take the Bonds of to not block the Bonds of Agony, right? Well, what can we do? We can Pathful Traveled it into Venomous Bite, into Pull Tunic, to Arousing Wave, pumping this up to I think 10 total. Or no, sorry, I think it's 9 total, right? And then we have 2 left over. We can like Codex and do a CNC. So if they don't block, they've lost. So let's say they do block and they block like 6 on Bonds of Agony. What we can do then is we can like Pathful Traveled and then pitch the Chi to Mask of Recurring Nightmares. So now they're down 3 cards out of hand, and then we can potentially like pull Tunic to like Beckoning Misplay, pitching Venomous, and then like finally end on like Codex of Frailty for Leave No Witnesses, right? So this is kind of like a premium example of putting your opponent into a situation where no matter what they do, they're fucked regardless. So either they're overblocking into Bonds of Agony, or they're taking the Bonds of Agony and then getting Codex to follow up. So like this is like the hand that probably like shouldn't exist in the game, but there are a lot of like scenarios in the game that you can kind of create, especially with like maybe some of the newer heroes as well, where no matter what your opponent does, they basically like lost either way. But I guess like the counter to this is obviously like interaction, like D-reacts or whatever. But even then, like if your opponent's like reacting on a Bonds of Agony and they path will travel and mask it, like you're still not in a good situation. So basically put your opponent in situations where no matter what they do, they'll basically lose regardless. So I wanted to kind of wrap up this series by just kind of going over an overview of ways that you get advantages. So we kind of talked about the flow of information, draw optimizations, and like drawing towards your good cards, and finally being annoying with like breakpoints, disruption, etc. So I think a lot of this is intuitive and you'll get better at it over time. I think the more games, the more that these become just like kind of your default kind of like go-to plays. But I did want to also make note that in the beginning, you may very rarely get punished for mistakes like this. So like we kind of looked at that Zen hand, for instance, right? That Zen hand basically sends 16 damage either way. But there are situations you can find yourself in where you could get punished for mistakes like that. Anyways, I wanted to thank you all again for watching. And if there's a specific topic that you want us to discuss, we're currently kind of compiling a list of other topics that we maybe want to address on the channel as well. Feel free to post in the comments. We do actually kind of read through the comments pretty vigorously. So if there's any kind of suggestions you have, again, we're very likely to actually probably try to cover them. Yeah, but with that, I think that's going to wrap up our series on 10 micro optimizations to help you improve your fab gameplay. If you want to see more of this, let me know. And yeah, bottom text, and I'll see you all next time.